Hi, and welcome to The Human Factor, the video podcast of Inc. and Fast Company. I'm Eric Schoenberg, the CEO of Inc. and Fast Company. Web Summit. What began as a modest gathering of Irish geeks, bloggers, journalists, and other odds and ends outside Dublin in 2009 has grown into a portfolio of massive events, attracting well over 100,000 attendees every year around the world. The attendees and speakers include unicorn founders, prominent tech writers, politicians, big tech sponsors, and thousands upon thousands of wannabes. With the return to live events this year, they'll flood into Lisbon for the Granddaddy event, Web Summit, Toronto for the North American version, Collision, and Kuala Lumpur for the Asian offshoot, Rise. The entrepreneur behind these tech mega meccas is Paddy Cosgrave, a soft-spoken Irishman who, by his own admission, knew more about music concerts and political movements than tech when he launched Web Summit. Not only has he built a remarkable growth business, but he's also led it through a pandemic, which required a whiplash-inducing pivot from live to virtual in a matter of months. There's a lot to be said here about business building, leadership, agility, and figuring out how to bring a whole zoology of techies together, show them a good time, and keep them coming back. Welcome, Paddy Cosgrave.
Thanks a million. It's great to be here. Really appreciate it.
Paddy, great to have you on the show. Where are you calling in from?
I'm in Dublin, Ireland at the moment, where it's incredibly hot, and then obviously in Ireland we don't have air conditioning in our houses, so the windows are unfortunately wide open here. But hopefully the sound quality holds up.
Well, good. What counts as incredibly hot in Dublin?
26, 27 degrees. Maybe that's like 80 Fahrenheit or something like that. I have no idea,
Yeah.
But it's hot for an Irishman. I think he got sunburned today. So, yeah.
You are one of the world's great conveners. Have you always been a connector, even as a kid?
That's a very good question. Maybe, I mean, in university, I got very involved in a debating society. So in the UK and Ireland, in Cambridge, Oxford, and Trinity and Dublin, there are three debating societies that are hundreds of years old. And I happened in my first week in college to go and take some free beers in this debating society. And over the next kind of 3 or 4 years, I ended up getting very involved and eventually bringing guests like John McCain and Archbishop Desmond Tutu, Senator John McCain, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and many others from around the world to Trinity to speak to students. So in some sense, maybe I had some background in bringing people together, but nothing in terms of a tech conference.
You strike me as possibly being an introvert, which maybe some people would find an odd status for someone with your calling. Do you see yourself that way?
Maybe. I mean, I think that maybe I don't. Yeah, I mean, I don't really know. I've never really thought about it. When we build our events, I think the focus is just focusing on attendee experience, and we've tried to do that relentlessly for the last decade. And some people seem to like it. And what started as something, incredibly small, has turned into something much, much bigger.
Yes, well, indeed it has. Just on the introvert-extrovert scale, obviously you've never, like most Americans, taken dozens of BuzzFeed polls about whether you're an introvert or an extrovert. After you graduated from Trinity, it seemed like your first love was politics. You headed Rock the Vote, about getting out the vote. Your first entrepreneurial startup was a company called My Candidate, I think, about how to analyze the positions of candidates in voters' districts. What attracted you to that topic, and what then drew you away to tech?
Well, in university, I was building. I didn't know, it wasn't really, they weren't called apps, but with friends, we were making. With a guy called Dave, we made a really terrible social network that nobody really ever used around kind of 2004. Made all sorts of little kind of viral invite tools for events, actually, whilst I was in university. And then I I don't know. I just kind of stumbled upon marrying building a tech platform to help people figure out who to vote for in an election. So I was always drawn to kind of software and design, not intentionally. It's just something that I was interested in. I didn't really think about building a business ever. I just thought about building kind of fun, cool things. And then yeah, I was very struck by the fact that I was going to kind of tech conferences, but they were in San Francisco or they were in Hong Kong, and Dublin didn't really have anything. And I just thought, well, maybe I can persuade some, entrepreneurs to come to Dublin and talk to the then very, very small kind of startup community in Dublin. And this might be kind of an interesting thing. And I just kind of set about organizing a conference as I thought it should be. It should be organized.
Okay. And the rest is history. An app, a social network built by a university student for other university students, that has a ring. It led to another small startup company that I could pick up, but the name escapes you right now. What? So that was the insight that sort of was the seed for Web Summit, the idea that there were these conferences going on in tech hubs, but nothing like it in Dublin. But Dublin certainly had its share of tech, entrepreneurs. It's a great place for technology companies to get started, well-educated, digitally savvy population. But it wasn't, it's no San Francisco yet. It's no Boston. Why did it take off in Dublin, do you think? This is the origin.
In some ways, I don't really know. We just had a particular approach. I had a strong feeling. I at least assumed that conferences of almost any scale use software to try and maximize what we've always called meaningful connections. So at the core of a conference, it's about meeting people. And at the time, software was enabling people to meet online in a very efficient way through social networks. And I just thought that, look, the way to do this when people come together in the real world is to overlay the event with software. And that software should improve the likelihood that the right people meet the right people. Because if you're in a room with 500 like-minded people, there's got to be, just 1% of that room should surely be able to create, value or just lead to interesting conversations for you as for your business or for whatever you might happen to be doing. And so we set about just building the tools that might make that happen. And over time, it really seemed to work, and people seem to like our approach. Everybody that comes on site has to use all of our kind of software before you get to the event. You use our software, so by the time you even get to the door, we know an awful lot about you. We're beginning to tell you who we think you should meet. We're beginning to tell other people, the most relevant people that you should meet, are kind of seeing your profile beginning to get suggested to them. And then, now tens of thousands of people just start kind of messaging each other in a frenzy, both during the event and before the event. And I think that leads to a lot more connections that matter. At the scale of a 10,000 person event, it's a near impossibility to just expect that you can walk around and bump into the right people. But there's literally no reason that some good software that can infer a lot about you and that you can feed a lot of information into can't be sufficiently sophisticated to kind of match you with relevant people to your business. So that's what we've spent the last kind of 10 years doing, and it seems to work. It's not. I mean, the idea that software is changing every industry. So there's nothing startling about this whatsoever, I don't think.
I do think that the emphasis on making connections among attendees or within the community of speakers who come, and it's a fairly large community. You have so many prominent people come as speakers, is part of the secret sauce that Web Summit has. When I first heard about it and became a regular speaker there myself, it was recommended as a place where you could go meet other speakers, and that Web Summit took special care to make sure that happened. I think that's really nice. I think about the technology that you use to enable those connections. They must have evolved over 10 years. All kinds of technologies do these days, and particular when it comes to that kind of artificial intelligence. walk us through, if you don't mind, the
Yeah,
capabilities of this connection software that you had at the beginning to what it can do now.
sure. Yeah, well, I was very lucky that I was living with a academic statistician who's now kind of a a full blown professor, and it was um, it made it very easy. The two of us working together to build some of the first kind of what people call algorithms, but ultimately any algorithm is it's just a basic formula. I think there's a lot of hype around algorithms and machine learning. They're just statistical approaches to trying to solve for a particular outcome. So that's all we do. I mean, we've not always got it right. At times there's been kind of terribly bad outcomes where two people arrive at Web Summit. There's say 70,000 people, and the top two recommendations are a former, basically somebody's getting recommended their former wife, and the wife who happens to be there is getting recommended the number one person they should talk to is their recently divorced husband. So we people share their phone books with us. And lots of information, and that allows us to begin to figure out how we now recommend the people you should meet to fall into two buckets. So first of all, we try and figure out, and this is the easy part, who at the event you likely already know that we should just alert you that these people happen to be there. Because at the scale of 70,000 people, that can be very daunting, and it's very efficient sometimes to immediately connect with some people that you already know. And then we interleave. So every second recommendation will be somebody we think you don't know based on everything we can tell about you, but we pretty much think you should know them. And this recommendation is happening on the sort of the opposite side of the mirror, where your profile is getting prominently, displayed to a portion of the attendees as well. And, we run lots of experimentation because this isn't there's no such thing as a perfect recommendation system, but it seems to be used relentlessly, certainly by our attendees. When you are a speaker at the event, you do have there's a small world effect where, first of all, you're probably already very, very deeply connected within tech, certainly if you're speaking at Web Summit. And then you also happen to be in the speaker room. And in addition to maybe using our software, we have a dedicated team to try and help you navigate the event and try and maybe set up meetings in advance. So as a speaker, you're kind of doubly spoiled, but as an attendee, you do get to have an incredibly powerful tool in your hand. And people seem to like it. It doesn't work for absolutely everyone, but it seems to work for most people, enough to not just propel Web Summit to the scale that it is, but also to help us start other events elsewhere in the world that are they've scaled faster than Web Summit, but are certainly not at the scale of Web Summit as of yet.
Yes. Well, everything you've just said reinforces my impression that the Web Summit makes an extraordinary attempt to connect people, and that is part of the secret of its growth for sure. It has been one of the things that certainly has kept me coming back. But there's other elements to the success of Web Summit, and I think are particularly highlighted by the way that you were able to pivot when the pandemic arrived. I mean, when you began to see what this disease was doing and how it was shutting down travel and closing borders and making people scared to be in the same room with each other, it must have felt like an arrow aimed at the heart of your business. And yet you kept going. Tell me about how that felt and how you decided to make the pivot to redirect the company the way you did.
Yeah, well, I think I would never like to claim that it was massively challenging, because we had 50 engineers on our over 50 kind of engineers and people building and designing product on our team. So as an event organizer, we're probably first and foremost we build software, and that meant that on March 2nd, we could shut our offices globally and cancel all of our in-person events and immediately pivot to running them online. And a lot of people had attended Web Summit in the past, often from very far away locations like New Zealand, where they'd bought tickets to the event, but were virtual attendees because they knew they could use the web and mobile app to essentially message and communicate with anybody and set up meetings. They mightn't meet face to face in Lisbon because they were in Auckland, but they were using our web and mobile apps in 2018 and 2019 to do that. So from our point of view, the only kind of couple of killer features that were missing to transition to fully online was video calling. So we had no video kind of conferencing feature inside our existing web and kind of mobile app. And so we just got to work, and we, built a pretty great product that the UN have now used for their events, and some, in the coming months, some of the biggest kind of conferences in the world will start to use. So nobody got let go. We hired people. Everything kind of worked out great, but that's not because of any great strategic, bold decision or anything like that. It just happened that by fluke we had decided at the very start that we were just going to build software, and this would propel our events to be differentiated and make them great, in our view at least. And then the pandemic hit, and we were kind of built almost for that environment. So we just got very, very lucky. I'd of course love to expound my greatness as I heroically guided the company through the pandemic. But in truth, I spent a lot of time talking with friends who I've got to know over many years who run purely non-digital events. Very, very analog, almost use no software, and they were in a very, very challenging situation. And some of them did a really kind of great job. But in our case, we just got incredibly lucky that we'd spent the previous decade building software.
Okay. Well, Paddy, your secret is safe with me. Let's talk about let's talk about live events, because we're going back to them.
Yep.
The Web Summit in Lisbon this November will be a return to live events. Are you confident that that you have the precautions and the in hand, and that you have the confidence of the public health authorities in Portugal to pull it off?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we started very modestly. We thought, okay, look, we might get 5,000 people together, and almost as every week has gone by, we've increased that to kind of 10,000 and 15,000 and 20,000 and 25,000. We keep on updating the Portuguese kind of health authority, and I think we'll hit the maximum threshold for a safe event in Lisbon. So there should be about 40,000 people that will join us from around the world, and we've built in all of the protocols and then some more that should be in place. People will have to have proof of vaccination, and failing that, they'll have to go and take a PCR test that will only be valid for 72 hours. So it's effectively everyone will be vaccinated that's at the event, and yeah, I mean, I'm just excited that everybody from the Werner Vogels, the CTO of Amazon, who you've met many times at the at Web Summit, is coming back, as are a whole new generation of startups that I've never met. All of these founders whose companies have kind of thrived, almost growing from nothing just before the pandemic, some being created during the pandemic, and now are already kind of runaway successes. So there's almost like a generation of companies that all of us haven't ever met any of the founders in person. And I think Web Summit will provide one of the first real opportunities for the tech ecosystem to get back together and meet face to face. And there are lots of new faces, probably more so than any year before, because we've spent a year away from each other. So I'm just really looking forward to that.
Let's talk about business models. The lines of revenues that Web Summit attracts are multifoliate, I would think. You've got ticket sales and sponsorships and so forth. Can you break it down for us? What brings in the money at Web Summit?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think breaking kind of Web Summit down into three components is helpful. So we wanted to build, hopefully it's massive. Eventually, we wanted to build the kind of biggest gathering of entrepreneurs in the world, and we've been fortunate to date that we've been able to do that. In doing that, we built a whole lot of software. and now we're beginning to make that software available mostly to the largest events in the world, as opposed to just the long tail of events. And that software is both to power online conferences and all the offline components of running an event of 100 or 200,000 people. And then we have a small venture fund that backs some of the most interesting startups that we see through Web Summit. So to come back to the event itself, it's broadly broken down into partners and exhibitors, what we call partners and exhibitors, and then ticket sales. And partners and exhibitors basically fall into very large ones like Amazon or Google, right the way down to very early stage companies. On ticketing, broadly, most people buy a kind of a ticket to Web Summit. It's maybe about $1,000 is maybe the current price of a ticket, and then there are two sort of premium level tickets. One is about €5,000, maybe that is about $6,000, and the other is about €25,000. I don't know what that is in dollars exactly, maybe $27,000, $28,000. And they just give you kind of slightly differentiated levels of access. Those tickets are mainly for Bitcoin bros, and we welcome them at our event if they want to go buy those tickets. Best of luck to them. I will not stand in their way. So that's kind of basically what we do, and people come from all over the world. About 180 different countries. The major markets are the UK is the biggest, the US is the second biggest, and then Germany and France, and those are kind of the huge markets. And then you'll find startups, which is wonderful, from literally every country on earth, and I think that's the big, one of the biggest trends over the last decade has been Silicon Valley has gone global, and startups, you write about them all the time. They're just literally coming from everywhere, which is fantastic. And now with the pandemic, it's abundantly clear that you really can start a company from anywhere and build a team that's based anywhere. And that's going to be incredibly inspiring and exciting to a new generation of entrepreneurs who thought previously they could only do it in Silicon Valley. So it's great.
Yes, it is a really healthy development. Great to see the democratization of entrepreneurship, for sure. There's an ancillary event at Web Summit, and often at the Partners Collision and Rise, I call them partners, the offshoots, whatever, called Founders. Can you tell us about that, and what's the purpose?
Yeah, so when we first organized Web Summit, we thought we should organize a conference within the conference for our speakers, who are mostly the founders of startups or tech companies. And that event runs for 2 days after Web Summit. So it's kind of like a little reward for all the speakers who fly in, and they do a bit of hard work and lots of prep to partake in the event, and then we wine and dine them. And we try to find the kind of 150 most interesting entrepreneurs on the planet. We try to refresh it constantly, so it's not about the entrepreneurs that have built the companies that we all know and use. It's always about the next wave of entrepreneurs. And so probably 80% of the founders kind of fall into that broad category. They're in the process of building a great company. And then we like to bring in kind of a mix of people who've kind of done it, and a sprinkling of people, including yourself, who you've built a great company as well, but you're also somebody of immense interest to any founder with an interesting story to tell, because you've got a pretty incredible platform.
Well, sure, and vice versa. Those people are of intense interest to me and my team at Inc. and Fast Company.
Yep.
Paddy, let's talk about you for a second. One of the consequences of the success of Web Summit is that you've become, planned or not, kind of a public persona, and it's not hard to find when you Google Paddy Cosgrave controversies around things you've said or moves you made, like moving Web Summit from Dublin, where it was originally, to Lisbon, and so forth. how does that feel? The sort of the, the fact that the press is sort of hanging on your, and social media are hanging on your every word. Has that changed your persona or the way you approach the way you lead your life?
I mean, maybe I'm blind, but I don't, I don't really think so. There's certainly in the context of Web Summit, when it moved, to Lisbon, it really just outgrew Dublin. But in outgrowing Dublin and moving to Lisbon, it left a kind of a deficit of over $100 million a year in terms of economic benefit to the city. So it was a huge blow to the city. It was by far and away the largest kind of business event that was ever held in Ireland. So that was a difficult thing, I think, for a lot of people. But by going to Lisbon, Web Summit just kind of thrived and really grew in scale massively. Our footprint now is 5x, more than 5x what it ever was in Dublin. With regard to, I've had a particular interest in whistleblowing. I think whistleblowers perform, a very important public function, not just in government circles when they uncover, maybe egregious surveillance by a government, but also sometimes in the private sector when it comes to, financial impropriety or fraud. And I set up a whistleblowing kind of agency in Ireland just over a year ago when the pandemic started. And one of the first whistleblowers that kind of came forward through that program ended up triggering the first ever criminal investigation into a prime minister in Ireland. So it's been an intriguing year. There's no history in Ireland of a very senior politician, deputy prime minister, ever being placed under formal criminal investigation for corruption. So it's kind of been very interesting. And obviously, when you're involved in something like that, you'll definitely generate a degree of heat, because that's not a great thing for the governing political party in the country where you live. So it's but it's been eye-opening and very satisfying to help several whistleblowers do what I think is really noble work.
Yes, that sounds like really important work, although not a great way to make friends in high places in government. In addition to moving Summit from Dublin to Lisbon, you moved Collision from New Orleans to Toronto, Rise from Hong Kong to Kuala Lumpur. Was it in every case outgrowing the original venue, or was there another calculation that you had in
mind? In the case of Lisbon, I genuinely think it's the nicest startup city in Europe. It's such a beautiful city. The weather is incredible. It's sort of like the West Coast. It's Europe's West Coast. Lisbon is such an incredible city. So many kind of tech companies have started there since, have moved there because of coming to Web Summit. And there's just a great vibe in the city. And that was a large part, of the reason for both going there and staying there. We had incredible offers from the British, the French, the German, the Italian, and Spanish governments to move Web Summit to their capital cities just over 2.5 years ago. And in the end, we basically chose the lesser of those offers just to stay in Lisbon, because I just, as a city, I think it's very much on the up. And the same applies in the case of Collision. It was in New Orleans. I think New Orleans is a magical city. We were, sort of thinking of kind of moving. A lot of people suggest either Los Angeles or San Francisco. That's, possibly really where you should have a kind of a major kind of tech conference. And then through a random series of kind of consequences, I got quite connected to Toronto. And then you started looking at the data, and it was almost similar to Lisbon. Here's a city that was often off people's radars, And suddenly, and kind of quietly in the background, you could see the huge growth in the number of kind of tech jobs, the number of people relocating to Toronto, and it just sort of felt like we could surf a wave that was already building. It was kind of the same with Lisbon. So we picked those two cities kind of on that basis. If that, hopefully, that kind of makes sense.
Sure. Let's kind of spin the ball forward. The conference business has been through such tremendous change. You've led a lot of it with a focus on technology. Kind of cast forward 5 years or 10 years. What's the business going to look like? And are the changes that were wrought by the pandemic going to stay with us, or was this just a detour?
That is a very good question. I think that's an incredibly pertinent question. It's something I've spent quite a considerable amount of time talking to founders, not just in the kind of events business, but lots of different industries. And I'm not great on making predictions. I always just think, look, is there data that indicates what the future may look like? And there are countries that are much more and have been much more open over the last 6 months. Certainly, the country I'm from, which is Ireland. And if you look at countries, for example, where music festivals are back open, they've been selling out tickets in record time. There's a lot of compelling data that suggests that group-based in real life activities are back above pre-pandemic levels. Now, the question is this a pendulum effect? My bet, if I am to predict anything, is yes, I think it's a bit of a pendulum where everybody's been effectively isolated for 18 months in most parts of the world. And there is going to be this wave like the Roaring 20s. Perhaps it lasts for a year, maybe it lasts for 2 years, where everybody's just like, oh my God, I never want to eat dinner again on my own. I just want to eat dinner with friends, and everybody's kind of getting together. And you see this with massive staff shortages in restaurants, not just in Ireland, but kind of everywhere. A lot of restaurants are doing incredibly well in countries all over the world that are beginning to open up. Does that persist over the next decade? I think that's a huge question. There have been literally tens of billions poured into tech companies that are predicated on the world remaining overwhelmingly virtual. And I think for a lot of those companies, some of which are publicly listed, their share prices be going sideways now for several months, because initially all of the smart analysts were like, this is here to stay. And then things begin to open up again. And humans, being humans, I think we're the ultimate social creature on the planet. We wanted to see each other again. So I don't know how far back the pendulum will swing, but I think we're in for a year or two of big group-based in real life activity. And then maybe we revert to a new normal where virtual plays, I think, maybe a bigger, if I'm to guess, a little bit of a bigger role than it did pre the pandemic.
Okay. All right. Good. Thanks. One of the great things about being you is that you are at the, on the bridge of a ship that is sort of leading the way to the future of technology, so that you know what the greatest minds in technology are thinking about at any given time.
Yeah.
What are the issues that you think are should be at the forefront of the conversation around tech and around society? What are the issues that you want to be highlighted in Lisbon in November?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there are some dominant themes that have persisted for several years and only grown in importance. And this is very untechy, but at the same time, it is very techy. So tax. I think tax is a fundamentally important issue. I think we're reaching, and I say this from Ireland, by the way, we're one of the only, I think now, 7 countries on the entire planet blocking both the White House and the European Union's attempt and the OECD's attempt and the G20's attempt to create a new and first kind of global agreement around corporate tax. Silicon Valley was funded, its inception, all of its seed capital, its Series A, its Series B, its Series B, its Series C, all came from the US government through, the Defense Department, the Pentagon, DARPA, National Science Foundation. And if you want real breakthrough innovation, the private sector we're incredible at commercializing breakthrough innovation. I mean, you go back, you take Steve Jobs. I think nobody was better than packaging together other people's inventions into an incredible consumer good that would become a runaway success. But if you looked at every key component inside the original iPhone, none of it was developed inside of kind of startups or the private sector. Literally everything was developed as a consequence of government funding. And I think we have to do a better job collecting tax to fund the future breakthroughs that then end up getting commercialized by great entrepreneurs. So tax is a major issue, I believe. Yeah, I mean, the other issues, for a number of years, we did our first Bitcoin talks at Web Summit, or crypto talks at Web Summit in 2010. We then had a crypto dedicated stage. And I made the really obscure decision of removing the crypto stage at Web Summit and distributing talks across several other stages. And partly I did that because I really didn't like the vibe around crypto for a number of years. It kind of went through this really early phase of just nascent innovation where very few people really knew or understood what was happening. It then seemed to attract a bunch of shysters, if that's a word that people in America use. It just smacked of a lot of fraud, and I'm really worried about that. And now I think it's really in a great place, and I think a lot of the right people are involved in the broad kind of crypto space. I think there's a lot of sensible money going in, and I think it's very much here to stay. So I just think that's another kind of fascinating and important theme. So I'll just give those two: tax and crypto.
Okay, good. And crypto, you're talking about blockchain too, is broadly understood, not just currency.
Yeah, everything under that umbrella. Yeah.
Yeah. That's really interesting. And yes, those are certainly important topics. I'll put you a philosophical question to wind things up here. You have the advantage in your role of rubbing elbows with some of the biggest thinkers in the world, and who would not want to be a keynoter at Web Summit or Collision or Rise. Knowing what's on the minds of those big thinkers, how do you feel about capitalism, which is at a particularly important crossroads of being tugged away from its moorings of shareholder supremacy towards something that's a little bit more complex, a little bit more nuanced, and a little bit harder to define? Or maybe another way to put the question is, for the future of free enterprise, are you an optimist?
Yeah, I think I'm an optimist. I just think there is we're in a world where there are, it's very simplified, but there are two versions of capitalism. One is a state-guided model which exists in China, and that is a pure copycat of what used to exist in the United States. The United States is a historically heavily state-guided capitalist system, and I think the constant chipping away at the power of the U.S. state has damaged the long-term innovative capacity of the United States. So as I think there's a lot of very smart. Bill Lazanick is a fantastic economist. Worries deeply, along with Michael Hudson, who's another wonderful economist, at the fact that today the majority of the profits of the S&P 500 go into share buybacks and bonds, and are no longer going into, at the rates they historically did, into R&D, which would drive the future kind of products of a lot of American companies. And I think the Biden White House is very considered on a lot of these issues, and they know that there's a lot that needs to be switched back on. America is this, there's no country on earth has managed to be more spectacularly innovative in the last 100 years than the United States. All the ingredients are there, but I think something has kind of slowed down over the last number of decades, and I think a lot of it has to do with the retrenchment of the state and of the government in funding base and foundational science. And as that's been happening, the very opposite has been happening in China, where the Chinese government have been pumping ever more money into very foundational R&D. And I think America will pivot and will be back to its best days, hopefully under the Biden administration over the next 4 years.
Okay, well, that is a hopeful note on which to end it. And whether the Chinese model of capitalism or the U.S. model of capitalism prevails, we know that that your company, Paddy, will have a conference there in the winning country. I thank you so much for being part of this. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks a million.
Thank you, Paddy. And this has been The Human Factor. Thank you very much for watching, and thank you to Brian Cornelius behind the camera, to Emma Gordon, Catherine Mainello, and Rose Levy, the producers. Thanks for watching. I'm Eric Schoenberg.